This really happened to me, and even now, saying it out loud still feels unreal. I never imagined that my own family would be the reason I ended up facing death row. It all started with a folded manila envelope sitting on the polished oak table in my sister's kitchen in Louisville. Inside was the paperwork that would ruin my life, documents with my forged signature accusing me of crimes I didn't commit. My brother sat across from me, smug, nursing a glass of bourbon, while my sister looked away like she couldn't bear to meet my eyes. At 63 years old, I realized I wasn't just betrayed, I was being sacrificed. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The kitchen smelled of fried chicken and stale whiskey. That afternoon, a strangely ordinary backdrop for the day. My life cracked apart. I remember my brother's voice, low, deliberate, each word, like he was setting a trap. "Face it, Ray," he said, his lips curling around the rim of his glass. "You've always been the easy target, and now you're the fall guy." I blinked, trying to process his words, while my sister fiddled nervously with the corner of a placemat. Outside, the cicadas droned against the late summer heat, oblivious to the war erupting in that room. At first, I thought it was some kind of sick joke. I'd worked most of my life as a machinist at a factory in Louisville's West End, punching the clock, paying my taxes, and keeping my nose clean. Sure, I wasn't rich, but I'd built something steady. My retirement was modest but enough, and I thought I'd finally enjoy a few years of peace before age truly caught up to me. But my siblings had other plans. They leaned on me after Mom died, pushing paperwork my way, saying it was about settling the estate. I trusted them. That trust was the nail in my coffin. Buried in those legal forms were fraudulently signed documents that tied me to bank accounts, shell companies, and stolen funds I had never seen. When the state came knocking, it was my name on the line, not theirs. That manila envelope was proof of everything and of nothing. Proof that my name had been tied to crimes. Proof that my family had plotted behind my back, but proof of their betrayal. To the law, it looked like I was the criminal mastermind. The betrayal cut deeper because I had no one else. My wife had passed years earlier from a stroke, and our only son, Derek, lived across the country in Portland, too busy raising his own kids to be more than a distant voice on the phone. My siblings were all I had left, at least that's what I told myself, and they used that loneliness like a blade. I can still picture my brother's face, that smug little smirk. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "You'll take the fall, Ray. It's too late now. Just ride it out. You're old enough, hell. You'll probably be gone before the worst of it catches up to you." Something inside me broke, not like a bone snapping, but like the slow splinter of glass under pressure. My chest went hollow. "Why me?" I whispered. "Because you're weak," he said simply. "Always have been." That word weak burned into me. And in that moment I realized that if I didn't fight back, if I didn't claw my way out of this, they wouldn't just ruin my life, they'd erase me. But I was 63 alone, outnumbered with the state, already circling like vultures. And within a month, I'd find myself in a courtroom, staring at charges that carried the death penalty. Fraud, racketeering, conspiracy. The DA painted me as some sort of criminal mastermind, an aging kingpin who thought he could outsmart the system. The truth, I was just an old man, betrayed by the only people I had left. The first time I sat in that courtroom, the fluorescent lights above buzzed so loudly they drowned out the hum of the crowd. My lawyer, a tired public defender named Mike Reynolds, shuffled papers, nervously whispering about plea deals I didn't understand. The prosecutor, meanwhile, moved like a showman striding across the courtroom with fiery confidence. She pointed at me, painting me as a man who had lived in shadows for decades, secretly orchestrating fraud across Kentucky. Every forged signature, every shady bank transaction, they all carried my name and my siblings. Not a trace. They sat in the gallery, stone-faced as if none of this touched them. My brother even had the audacity to nod at me like he was silently congratulating himself. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand and shout. They did this to me. I didn't do any of it. But my lawyer squeezed my arm and hissed, "Don't make it worse." Worse. The word echoed in my skull. By the second week, I stopped believing I'd walk free evidence, stacked higher than the Ohio River floods. The jury looked at me like I was already guilty. And then came the unthinkable. The prosecutor announced she was seeking the death penalty. At 63, I was facing the possibility of dying strapped to a gurney, not for something I had done, but for the sins of my family. I remember the night I first stepped into my cell at the Louisville Metro Detention Center waiting for trial. The air smelled like sweat bleach and despair. The bed was little more than a metal slab with a thin mat, and as I sat there staring at the cracks in the paint, I realized I had two choices: accept my fate or find a way to fight. For a while, I leaned toward acceptance. I was tired. My bones ached. My back stiffened every morning. Maybe my brother was right. Maybe I was weak. But then one night, I overheard two guards talking about my case as they passed by. "That old man's cooked," one said with a chuckle. "Imagine 63 and running some big fraud scheme. He's done for." Their laughter stabbed me deeper than anything my brother had said. I wasn't cooked. I wasn't done. And I sure as hell wasn't weak. Something in me reignited. I decided then and there that I wasn't just going to clear my name. I was going to burn my siblings' little empire to the ground. But revenge wasn't going to come easy. It never does. And the first step was survival. The days in jail bled into each other. Breakfast trays of cold eggs and stale toast. Hours in the common area, listening to other inmates brag about their crimes. Nights punctuated by distant shouts and the clanging of doors. I kept my head down, but I kept my ears open. And little by little I learned how to navigate the system, how to read people, how to stay invisible when I needed to, and how to listen without being noticed. That skill became my lifeline, because somewhere between the second and third week, I learned a truth that chilled me to the core. My siblings weren't just setting me up, they were still running their scheme right under everyone's noses. The first time I realized it, I was on a monitored call with my son, Derek. His voice was distant, strained, but he tried to reassure me. "Dad, it'll help. It'll look into things." And then, almost in passing, he said something that froze my blood. "Aunt Linda asked me to sign some papers last week about Grandma's estate. It didn't look right. So I didn't." My heart pounded. They were still forging documents, still trying to rope family into their web. Even while I sat in jail, facing death, they were moving pieces around the board. That was when the fear turned into rage. They thought I was weak. They thought I'd roll over and die quietly. But they didn't know what kind of fight an old man has left when he's been cornered, stripped of everything, and left for dead. They didn't know that I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to destroy them. And the first weapon it'd need wasn't a gun, or a knife, or even a lawyer. It was the truth. But the truth is a slippery thing. And in a courtroom where lies wore suits and smiled at the jury, I had to figure out how to sharpen that truth into a blade. I learned that truth never travels alone. It needs handlers' roots and a few accomplices to get it past fortress lies. From my cell, I started building that network. First, I needed paper ledgers, corporate filings, bank statements. I needed breadcrumbs that tied my siblings' names, not mine, to the shell companies and the diverted funds. Problem was, Most of that paper didn't show up in a single pile you could point to. It was spread across filings in Ohio, shell addresses in Delaware, and small community banks that didn't bark loud when money moved through them. It was the kind of thing people hide, in plain sight, layered under legalese, and the kind of complacency you get in a family used to getting away with things. My son Derek was the person I trusted to handle the outside. He'd been reluctant at first. I could hear the hesitation in his voice over the monitored call. Every pause, every carefully chosen word weighed like contraband. "Dad, I don't want to start a war with them," he said. But he also knew me. He knew that once I'd been cornered, the instinct was not to curl, but to strike. "I don't want you poking at them unless you can do it clean," I told him. "No threats, no yelling. You'll get us both killed if you're sloppy. Just look where things are filed. Follow the addresses. If you see anything in my name that I never signed, save it. Get certified copies." He did. He drove through county clerks' offices in Ohio and Indiana, sat in plastic chairs under humming fluorescent lights, and paid $10 here, $15 there for people to print the same pages no one had thought to look into. He found an LLC in Columbus, with a manager listing that matched my sister's middle name, an old P.O. box in Cincinnati that led back to my brother's old deli, and a series of trust documents filed in Jefferson County that referenced accounts frozen or moved within weeks of my mother's funeral. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to begin drawing lines. While Derek worked the public record grind, I worked the human angles. Jail teaches you a strange economy of favors and small exchanges. I traded stories for cigarettes, phone time for tips. A man in a neighboring cell. Vaughn used to work as a courier for a private investigator until he'd fallen on hard times. He told me about how certain law offices routed sensitive deposits through benign-looking trust accounts, how a signature could be appended years later if someone knew which clerk to threaten or bribe. Vaughn's stories smelled like truth, because he named names and mentioned hotels and blocks I could place on a map. Armed with that, I started to exploit the little cracks in the system. I wrote letters carefully worded to county clerks, asking for certified copies of specific filings. I sent them through the jail's mailroom with return addresses that would not raise eyebrows. I used the public defender's time to file motions that pulled deposition transcripts and subpoenas into play. Mike Reynolds, my lawyer, was a tired man, but not a stupid one. When I showed him what Derek and Vaughn had dug up, I could see his jaw tighten. He began to believe we could fight, but belief alone doesn't win courtrooms. You need leverage, something that would make my siblings sweat. You need, in essence, to make them feel the same dread. They'd left me with the looming certainty that everything they'd built on forged paper and borrowed names could, with one well-placed subpoena, unravel. So we started small, a civil motion, a discovery request aimed at one of the shell companies. The prosecutor scoffed at first. "This is a racketeering case," she told us. "You don't get discovery like that when death is on the table." But discovery can be a slow drip that drowns arrogance. We wanted records the prosecutor didn't have yet. Deposit slips, internal memos, odd reimbursements. If any of those bore signatures, dates, or routing numbers that tied back to my siblings, the DA would be forced to look. The worst-case scenario was they'd ignore it. The best was they'd have to admit. The case against me was built on shaky ground. That's where the first real turning point came. One of the accounts we subpoenaed, a small family trust that had funneled funds into a chain of Shell LLCs, contained a ledger entry with a bank check that had my name on it. At first glance, that looked like the end of my story. But when Derek pushed for a copy of the check image, something jumped out. The signature's slant was wrong. Mine slanted right. Whoever had signed that check had an odd leftward curl on the tail of the Y in my name. A forger's quirk, sure, but one you could point out to an expert. We got an expert. I found a retired handwriting analyst through a phone number scratched in the back of a legal pad Vaughn had given me. She came down to the prison visiting room with a folder and a quiet confidence. She studied letters I had written over the decades, postcards, a note I'd left on my wife's pillow, my son's old birthday cards. Then she compared them to the suspect's signatures. "It's not his," she said bluntly. "Look here, these strokes are too deliberate. Someone trained themselves to imitate him, but the micro movements, the cadence, it's off. Whoever did this was trying too hard to make it look like Mr. Raymond Kincaid." Hearing an expert say my name like that, my full name used in a report, felt like being given back a piece of myself. The prosecutor called it an opinion, but opinions stack into jury doubts faster than you'd imagine. Suddenly, what had looked like a neat case began to show ragged edges. It still wasn't enough to free me. Not even close. For that we needed names attached to specific transactions. We needed to show that my siblings had executed the transfers, that they had access to the accounts, that they'd benefited materially while I sat in jail. We needed witnesses who would be willing to tell the truth. That's where fear and greed intersect. People with a conscience rarely step forward for free. The ones who do are often looking for protection, money, or retribution of their own. I didn't have money, not in the sense that the crooked usually mean. But I had time, and I had a promise I could keep once this was over. The truth would be known. For people with loose consciences, being known sometimes felt worse than being paid. We found one such person in the most ordinary place, a payroll clerk at a small trucking outfit in Louisville, who'd been instructed to cut checks to a thinly disguised LLC. She'd grown suspicious when the amount started to climb, and the work never matched the invoices she kept. Copies, little carbon duplicates shoved into a desk drawer. When Derek showed up at her house, he didn't threaten. He offered her a chance to unburden herself. She wanted nothing more than to sleep without the heavy hand of uncertainty. She wanted someone to tell the truth, so she could stop dreaming about forged signatures at night. Her testimony was shy and raw. She testified that checks made out to RK Enterprises had been requested by a man she recognized from a deli near her mother's old church. Rudy, my brother, who had a laugh like a cash register. She described telephone calls, afternoons, when envelopes arrived that smelled faintly of smoke and cheap aftershave. That call connected Rudy to the ledger in a way a report never could. The prosecutor couldn't ignore it, at least not completely. The DA's office began to pivot. They ordered their own subpoenas. They interviewed bankers. They called witnesses who had once worked for my siblings. Each call they made forced my siblings to answer for days of sins they'd thought were well buried. And here's the cruel, beautiful irony. Once the state focused on my siblings instead of me, they started to trip over their own lies. People who had been silent in the face of family pressure became suddenly helpful when the state wanted their cooperation. My brother, who once thought he could nod and smile his way through anything, began to pace. My sister stopped making eye contact altogether. But revenge is not a straight line. For every truth we found, there were two more deceptions waiting. My family had been careful. They had layers of plausible deniability, meetings scheduled at diners, invoices that matched no actual work, but came with receipts from legitimate vendors, friends who had been paid to swear to alibis. Unwinding that required patience, the way surgery requires a steady hand. Patience is something you get when you have nothing but time and a slow-burning rage. We kept pushing. Derek kept filing requests from outside, and Mike kept demanding discovery that made prosecutors groan. The DA wanted a quick conviction, a headline, a tidy narrative of justice, but a quick conviction required a neat villain, and the more our evidence unfolded, the less I fit the tidy narrative. Then, late one night, a call came through the jail phone that made my heart jump so hard it hurt. It was from a number I didn't recognize. Derek's voice was thin with adrenaline. "Dad, they found something in Rudy's storage unit, a ledger. It lists names, amounts, dates, and Ray. It lists payments to an account that routes to a P.O. box registered under Linda's daughter's name. It's all there. I'm heading to the storage place now." Something cold and raw slid through me. For months we had been collecting fragments, signatures, bank slips, witness testimony, and now a ledger, neat and hand-penned, might be the central spine that made the rest of the evidence live. If that ledger held the dates and amounts that matched the transfers into the shell accounts tied to my forged signatures, then the prosecution looking for a conviction would have to acknowledge that my siblings had motive and means, and that their fingerprints were all over the operation. But storage units are public, and luck is not. I could hear the clerk's voice in my head, the way someone who rents a unit thinks of it only as a place to keep things. Rudy had been cavalier with his records because he thought paper could hide behind dust and time. He'd been wrong. "Don't get excited," yet Mike said. When I told him, "We need to verify chain of custody. We need witnesses who can say this ledger was in that unit before any of us knew it was there. Otherwise, it's just a book. Then make them find the ledger," I said. "Make them show it in court. Make them put my siblings in the chair while they explain why my name is on paper I never signed." There was a quiet determination in my voice that surprised even me. The gears were turning now, and I could feel the momentum. The ledger could change everything if it cooperated. Derek's voice on the other end trembled. "I'm at the unit. There's a padlock. There's a ledger on a shelf with entries that mention dates, that match the transfers. There's also a receipt from a bank deposit, a small regional bank in Shelbyville, and the teller stamp is on it. I'm taking pictures. He'll get you certified copies. Be careful," I said. "Don't touch anything until they verify it. Take pictures. Call me back." He hung up and the cell clicked with a silence that felt loaded with possibility. For the first time in months, I felt something other than dread. The raw electric pulse of hope. But hope is dangerous. It makes you impatient. It makes you take risks. And the ledger sitting in Rudy's storage unit, if it was real, and if it said what Derek claimed, would not only expose my siblings, it would force them to make choices. And people who think they are untouchable make bad choices when the ground starts to shift under them. As the jail lights hissed and the distant radio in the guardroom played a song I half remembered from my youth, I wrapped my hands around my knees and waited for the next call. The ledger's pages turned in my mind like a set of dominoes one pull, and the whole family improvisation could come crashing down. The ledger sat in my head like a promise I hadn't yet earned. For 3 days, I lived between two worlds, the gray echoing one inside the cell and the swirl of movement my son described on the phone. Derek's calls were always hurried, now whispers between motions, photos sent to an email I could only check once a week through a legal aid. He found more than a ledger. He found envelopes with bank deposit slips, a faded receipt for a safety deposit box, rental at a Citizens Bank branch in Shelbyville, and a napkin with a hurried scribble a name and a number that matched a deli Rudy had sold years ago. When the DA's office finally took the storage unit seriously, their interest came like a high tide. Detectives combed the unit, dusted the shelves, took photos of the ledger pages, and stamped everything with a thin official certainty I could feel through the phone. Hearing Derek's voice crack, with a mix of triumph and fear, made me both proud and sick. It wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time in months, the story had a new axis. Handwriting matched to bank stamps, deposits timed to funeral arrangements, a paper trail that stank of intent. In court, the ledger became a living, humiliating thing for my siblings. The prosecutor held it up like a Bible, flipping to pages that listed names, amounts, and dates that lined up suspiciously with the charges. My brother's face went white the first time the pages were read aloud. My sister's hands trembled, but the ledger alone was not a verdict. As my lawyer kept reminding me, signatures could be forged, receipts could be planted, and ledger entries could be coerced into meaning more than they did. The legal world moves slowly, and the state could still squeeze us into their narrative if they wanted to. So we kept moving. Derek and I made a crude but effective team. He did the legwork, the times in clerks' offices and bank basements, and I coordinated, from within the small universe of the detention center letters, whispered ideas during visits, a stubborn, methodical insistence that we follow every lead. I was a machinist by trade. I'd built things my whole life. I could see how pieces fit together, and now I saw the scheme as a machine interlocking parts cogs, greased by favors and fear. If you knew where to pry, the machine could be pulled apart. We found people who had been paid hush money, but we also found those who'd been pushed aside once the money stopped. A favored contractor in Jefferson County, who'd once helped funnel invoices, stopped returning. Rudy's calls when the amounts dwindled. A bank teller, now retired, remembered a deposit that had worried her because the account number didn't match any business she knew. She kept a note in her records. It was mundane, a clerk's scribble, but it matched a deposit slip Derek had pulled from another bank's archive. The more small coincidences we gathered, the larger the picture became. The prosecutor's strategy at first was to keep the spotlight on me and the supposed pattern of my guilt. It was easier to point to one old man and call him a mastermind than to dismantle a family's decades of careful theft. But the ledger and the corroborating receipts forced her hand. She began to split her case, keeping charges on me, but widening her net to include inquiries into my siblings. Once the state's interest spread to Rudy and Linda, their arrogance started to curdle. That arrogance was dangerous. It's a funny thing. People who live by manipulation convince themselves they are untouchable until the first subpoena lands. The first subpoena Rudy received was for a set of corporate emails his business had sent in late 2019. He laughed at the paper at first, then lied, then panicked. He started making calls to friends and former employees in a way that made them uneasy. The deli closed early for a week with plumbing problems, and Linda stopped answering family texts entirely. Those silences, which had once been comfortable to them, began to choke. We began to play a longer game. If the prosecutor wanted a headline quick, we insisted on patience. Every document we could subpoena, every person who might have knowledge, we pushed, prodded, and when necessary, appealed or filed motions. My public defender, Mike Reynolds, turned from a man resigned to a routine of plea bargaining into a strategist who began to enjoy the hunt. He filed motions that the DA had not expected, forcing discovery in corners they'd left dark. Every motion cost us time, but time was what I needed. Old men don't hurry. We had to let the truth accumulate like sediment until the river of facts swept away. The comfortable lies. a surprising ally emerged in the form of a junior assistant in the DA's office. Bright scuffed shoes, an expression that said she'd been hired by the system to believe in tidy endings. She'd been assigned to my file as a favor and, curious, started poking at details. When she asked why a deposit from an LLC had been routed through 3 different small banks instead of one, a supervisor told her to mind her step. She didn't. She dug. What she found were internal emails, drafts where Rudy and Linda had discussed clearing some funds and listing a third party as the manager. She'd been the sort of person who noticed small inconsistencies, and once noticed those inconsistencies accumulate into facts a jury pays attention to. The DA's office, suddenly uncomfortable with the breadth of their own case, began to split. The prosecutor who had wanted the death penalty now had to prepare for a messy, sprawling trial, where the villain might not be a single old man, but rather a family that had finessed community trust into personal gain. Politics got involved. The paper got wind of a possible family scandal. Headlines began to whisper about local family alleged in elder fraud. My siblings fumed with a fury that comes when a carefully constructed persona blinks under public scrutiny. They made mistakes. Desperation softens the tongue. Rudy made a call from a burner phone to a man who'd done odd jobs at the deli, begging him to remember it differently. The man recorded the call because he was angry and wanted a record. Linda, thinking she was clever, tried to intimidate the payroll clerk, who'd already testified, promising silence and consolation, if only she'd stop talking. The clerk went to the DA with the recording of the threat. When you hold someone in public contempt and then try to make them go silent, you expose the very tactics you wanted to hide. Then there was the strange and crooked geometry of family pride. My siblings had grown so used to their small victories, quiet transfers, discreet favors, that they never imagined being squarely in the prosecutor's aim. When the ledger's pages were matched with deposits, dates and signatures that bore their familiar scratches, their world became untenable. They started to fracture. Old loyalties cracked. Cousins who had once signed affidavits on their behalf began to ask for immunity. Friends who'd taken loans from Rudy's businesses suddenly remembered late payments and strange accounting. Meanwhile, I kept writing. In the small hours before lights out, I scrawled notes to Mike, questions, suggestions, names of places Derek had visited, banks he'd approached. The prison mailroom is slow, but it's reliable if you keep at it. My handwriting, that plain machinist scrawl, sat beside the forensic samples the state had used to try to pin me to forged checks. It felt a little like throwing myself at the system and watching whether it would catch me or hand me to the wolves. And then came the day a former business partner of Rudy's walked into the DA's office with an envelope. He had been paid too little and forgotten, and resentment had done what truth sometimes cannot propel a witness into the light. He'd kept a set of invoices that showed transfers from Rudy's businesses to shell entities listed in the ledger. He also identified a sequence of emails where Rudy's thumb had hovered too close to the send button before backing away drafts that included the instructions to move funds. His testimony was shaky but coherent, and when combined with the ledger, the bank images and the handwriting analysis, it began to look like pattern rather than accident. The prosecutor, faced with a branching case and the growing evidence that my siblings had orchestrated the transfers, did what prosecutors do when their neat narratives become messy. They split charges, they negotiate, they leverage. Rudy was offered a chance to avoid a long federal indictment. If he cooperated, Linda was told she could face reduced charges in exchange for testimony, and those offers changed the calculus of family loyalty faster than anything I could have done from a cell. But people like my siblings are not built to confess. They are built to deflect and then to double down. When Rudy received his offer, his first instinct was to refuse, not because he believed he was innocent, but because the idea of naming his sister and his last name in the same plea documents felt like a betrayal of the only identity he had left. He weighed proudly, being a scoundrel, against the quiet humiliation of becoming a government witness. Pride can be a dangerous currency. One night, when I was allowed a rare extra visit, Derek told me in the parking lot of the visiting room that Rudy had decided to fight. He was going to go to trial, he said, because what mattered more to him than prison was the story he would tell. His version where he was clever, not cruel. For a moment I felt fear not because Rudy would win, but because men who have nothing to lose can move unpredictably. They can make decisions that hurt others in an attempt to salvage their own dignity. The DA, sensing this, moved to secure evidence before Rudy's refusal could produce more smoke and mirrors. They froze assets, issued emergency orders, and took physical custody of certain documents. My siblings responded with lawyers of their own men who threatened countersuits and smear campaigns, who whispered about my age and my alleged history to the press. The small-town social web they had spun began to fray in bright, visible places. And then my phone call came, one of those calls that make you hold your breath against a future you hadn't imagined. Derek's voice was sharp. They found something else, he said, an address book in Rudy's truck. Names, dates, a shorthand for payments. And Ray, there's a note, a name crossed out and replaced with yours. It looks deliberate. My stomach dropped. Crossed out names are dangerous because they imply change someone once listed as a beneficiary or a recipient, now removed. A name replaced with mine could mean my siblings had been shifting blame for a while, or it could mean something more pernicious, that they had planned me as the eventual fall guy, long before my mother's death. The evidence was spiraling into deeper meaning, and the deeper the meaning, the more likely it would stick in court, like resin. We were in the middle of the war now, and the war is a thing that eats at dignity and spits out consequences. I had wanted retribution, but the machine of justice moved, not on feelings, but on documents, testimony, and the brittle courage of people who finally chose to tell the truth. The next week's hearing would change everything. This really happened to me, and the courtroom's smell of paper and bleach still haunts me. By the time the hearing arrived, the city felt split in two. Sighed, still convinced I'd been a quiet villain, the other beginning to suspect the truth had teeth. When the hearing opened, the courtroom was packed like a Sunday service. The judge, Martel, a man with a scar along his jaw and a reputation for letting the law speak, plain looked out over the room and rubbed his thumb on a folder, as if the motion papers were a splinter. He couldn't quite get out. The DA's office sat to his right in a cluster of nervous folding chairs. My public defender, Mike, to my left, molested a stack of legal pads, like a man keeping a rosary. Derek stood in the gallery, a silence on his face. He'd seen before only when the machines at the hospital were running and time felt thin. The prosecutor began with a practiced cadence, laying out the state's case, like a builder displaying his plans. "Your Honor," she said, "we are prepared to proceed on the charges as filed, but recent developments require the court's attention concerning the potential involvement of additional parties." She slid a folder across the table, and the ledger, hard-bound, smudged Rudy's handwriting looping like a liar's signature, felt suddenly heavier than a Bible. I watched my siblings. Then Rudy kept his jaw tight as if bracing for a blow. Linda's fingers were folded so hard they blanched white. The gallery exhaled like a single organism. For months they'd been the steady hands that moved money. Now the motions they'd hidden in soft envelopes were being read aloud in a sterile chamber of law. The first witness, the DA called, was the payroll clerk's soft-spoken, middle-aged, the sort of woman people forget in a crowded room until she speaks. She walked to the stand with a bundle of photocopies and looked at me directly for the first time. When she opened her mouth, something in the courtroom shifted. Her voice was small but firm. I processed checks for RK Enterprises. She said I was instructed to make checks payable to a list of names. Once I questioned why an account number didn't match a company name, I was told to process it anyway, and that any questions would be handled upstairs. I kept copies because it made me nervous. She described phone calls, short, polite, with an edge under the sentences. She described envelopes. She described a man, Rudy, who would come by sometimes, always with a smell of old coffee and bacon grease. She described dates that matched the ledger and the deposits Derek had found. Her testimony was a series of small, undeniable things that, when stitched together, made a seam that no prosecutor could ignore. Then the DA called Vaughn, the courier-turned-inmate, who'd given me the initial tip about how signatures were sometimes appended. After the fact, Vaughn's voice scraped like gravel. He talked about sequences which offices handed packages to which men odd hours. When bank transfers were discussed in diners, the names that circled back to Rudy and Linda. The judge watched him like a man who'd seen too many reenactments and wanted the real one. By the time the DA rested, the ledger wasn't a prop anymore. It was a map. The judge excused the gallery for a moment, while lawyers leaned in, whispering like conspirators at a funeral. Outside cameras flashed a reporter's tone, threaded through the courthouse corridors, like a rumor. For the first time, the narrative had expanded beyond me. It was no longer plausible that one 63-year-old machinist had orchestrated the careful ballet of transfers and shell entities that lined the ledger's pages. The ledger pointed always toward my siblings. We left the hearing in a kind of daze. Derek met me in the parking lot under a sky the color of cheap overalls. He looked exhausted but alive, in a way men feel after being spared a bullet. "They're circling Dad," he said. "The DA's office is opening separate files. They served Rudy with additional subpoenas. Linda's accounts are being frozen." "You heard the clerk?" I asked. He nodded. She held up the ledger in court, like it was a smoking gun. For a moment I tasted victory, metallic and thin, like a quarter pressed to the tongue. But victory is a slow animal. It comes in parts, and often leaves teeth marks on your hands. I knew the law well enough to know that this was not yet the end. Siblings in my family had survived worse things by leaning on friends, buying loyalty, and hiring men who could make trouble for witnesses. They had lawyers that filed motions like hand grenades. They had pride and time, and a local reputation that had been something like currency. The DA's office moved faster than I expected. Days slipped into motions and counters, subpoenas, and emergency orders. Rudy responded with the arrogance of a man who had not yet felt the bite of consequence. He retained a lawyer who wore too many suits and threatened to take the whole thing to federal court. Linda, meanwhile, started to crumble. I watched her from across the parking lot one afternoon, her hands pressed together as if in prayer, but she wasn't praying. She was panicking in a way that made her small and human, and that frightened me more than any swagger Rudy could muster. Then came the call that cut through the incrementally better days, a voice I didn't recognize on the line, clipped and low. "You need to be careful," Raymond, the caller, said. "There are people who don't want ledger pages spread out in a courtroom. They'd prefer certain things remain quiet. Watch your back." The line went dead before I could push for more, but the words sat heavy. threats are common in these circles. Being told you're in danger is not the same as being safe. I told Mike, who told the DA, who told no one. It seemed the courthouse servers hummed on, oblivious. The world kept doing what it does best, pretending procedure was the same as justice. A week later, a man connected to my siblings, someone they'd hired to remove sensitive documents, was found dead in a motel off I-65. The news came in a thin wire from a reporter who smelled opportunity. The DA's office labeled it suspicious. The local paper made a spectacle of rumor. My siblings called emergency counsel. My son's face wicked with fear. When he told me, "Dad," he said, "people are saying he overdosed. People are also saying they saw a baby blue van near his room." It felt like a circle tightening. Men who had been used to manipulating small things now faced a big, blunt world where bodies and print media and subpoenas could bleed into a story that mattered. It wanted their ruin, but not like this. It wanted their reputations and their freedom, taken not for anyone else to be killed in the crossfire of their panics. The DA called a press conference. The prosecutor stood between microphones, like a woman holding back a flood. "We will pursue justice," she said, eyes trained on a camera lens. "We will follow the evidence wherever it leads." Her voice had steel under it. Now a prosecutor with a new file and an unwillingness to be taken in by tidy narratives. Then something happened that made the ground under my feet tilt. Linda's sister asked to speak to the DA privately. Her counsel said nothing to me and nothing to the press. I watched from the prison phone as Linda's figure entered a room in the DA's office and sat across from the prosecutor. The visiting room was a small square of glass and plastic. My heart yoked itself to the movement of her chair, as if I could feel each scrape. When the DA called our lawyers back into court the following day, the air was different. There were fewer faces in the gallery. The judge's eyebrows rose as if he'd been given a puzzle with a missing piece. The prosecutor's jaw was tight. She read into the record a motion that staggered me for its simplicity and cruelty. "Your Honor," she began, "we have received statements and proffers from individuals who implicate additional parties in the scheme under investigation. One of those proffers is from Linda Kincaid, who has provided testimony and documents supporting the claim that Mr. Raymond Kincaid's name was used without his consent as part of a scheme orchestrated by family members." The sentence was a slow punch. My stomach dropped. Relief warred with suspicion. The judge allowed a recess. I felt oddly sick, like someone had unloosed a trap behind my ribs. If Linda's proffer was real, it could be the salvation the DA needed to disentangle me from their story. But proffers are a complicated thing. Bargains, deals, and sometimes lies wrapped in immunity. When someone close turns, states, evidence, motives are rarely pure. People lovely and crooked. Both cut deals when their backs are to the wall. After the recess, the DA's office read a statement into the record. Linda's voice recorded, and tremulous narrated a history of fear, of pressure, of being told not to ask questions. She spoke of envelopes and signatures, of cajoling and threats, of nights when money moved and family dinners grew quieter. She said she had signed things she would not have signed if she'd known then what she knew now. The recording ended with a single line that lodged into me like a shard. "We never meant for Ray to see this. He was supposed to be gone before anyone looked." The courtroom went cold. My breath lodged at the back of my throat. Those words were not an admission of murder, yet they suggested something worse. A plan that treated me as expendable, a decision to sacrifice me for the family's survival. The implication was poisonous if they'd planned for me to be removed from the picture. If that was a phrase that meant action, rather than idle boasting, then the ledger wasn't just proof of fraud. It was a map to a conspiracy that had gone beyond numbers. I wanted to stand to shout that I'd never been willing to die for them, that I'd never agreed to any of it. But Mike's hand on my knee stopped me. He'd seen this before. The way men reach for absolution in courts and find only more questions. The prosecutor looked over at the DA's assistants, then at Judge Martell. "Your Honor," she said. "Given the severity of the allegations and the new proffers, the state requests time to investigate possible threats and to determine whether charges should be expanded to include additional offenses beyond fraud." Judge Martell tapped his pen. "Granted," he said. "We will recess until further notice." As the gavel came down, something cold and careful slid into my chest. Linda's words had opened a door I was not sure I wanted to step through. The idea that my family had ever discussed making me vanish, whether by paper or by darker means, curdled the air. My throat closed around a question that had no easy answer. Had their plan been merely to ruin my reputation, or had they considered, in the small, cowardly way family sometimes does, to ensure I wouldn't be around to challenge them? I left the courtroom with Derek at my side, his jaw set, his hands balled. The city felt thin and uncertain under our feet. It had become clear that this was no longer only a legal battle. It was family against truth, and truth against the lengths people will go to protect what they think belongs to them. That night, in the quiet of my cell, I counted the names I trusted and found them scarce. The ledger's pages turned in my head like a sinister calendar. By morning, I knew one thing with a painful bright clarity. If I was to survive, not just be acquitted, but survive the people who had once called themselves my family, I would need evidence that cut deeper than signatures. I would need something that proved intention. I would need to know what they had meant by gone. The next morning, a package arrived at my lawyer's office, addressed to me. It contained a single folded piece of paper, unmarked, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and lemon oil. Inside, in a shaky hand, I recognized too well were 3 words. They planned it. The bottom of the page held a single line: "Find the tape." For a moment the room spun. Find the tape. Find the tape. The words were a compass point, and wherever that tape led, it would either save me or damn us all. The note rattled in my lawyer's hands like a loose bearing inside an old engine. 3 words. They planned it, had a way of amplifying every suspicion I'd carried, since the first envelope sat on that kitchen table. But it was the second line that kept thudding in my skull, harder than the jail's heavy doors. Find the tape. I couldn't sleep that night. The detention block was humming its usual late-night chorus, snoring. Metal clanks, the distant echo of someone cursing, but all I heard were those words. If there was a tape, it meant someone in my family had been foolish or arrogant enough to record themselves. People like Rudy didn't usually leave trails. They left whispers. A tape was something else entirely. A tape was proof that didn't need interpretation. A tape was a ghost that could walk into court and speak for itself. The next morning I told Derek through the phone. His eyes lit up on the other side of the glass. "If there's a tape, Dad, he'll find it. Careful," I whispered. "If it exists, they'll kill to keep it buried." Derek started digging through every lead we had. Old safety deposit boxes, the contents of Rudy's storage unit, even Linda's car glove box when she left it overnight at a mechanic's shop. Days stretched into weeks, each phone call ending with "nothing yet." But then one evening he sounded different, breathless, like a man running downhill too fast. "Dad, listen. You remember? Uncle Walt's cabin, out by Taylorsville Lake. I hadn't thought of that place in years. A creaking wooden shack we'd used for fishing trips. When we were kids, long since abandoned, after Walt passed. They used it, Derek said. I think it was their meeting place. I went out there, boards nailed over the windows, dust everywhere. But there was a metal tin under one of the floorboards. It had old receipts, cigarette butts, a flask, and a cassette tape. My heart jumped. Did you play it? Not yet. I didn't want to touch it more than I had to. I took pictures. It's labeled in Rudy's handwriting. Just one word: insurance. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone until my knuckles ached. Rudy was many things: arrogant, greedy, cruel, but he wasn't careless. If he labeled something insurance, it meant he intended to use it against someone else one day. The thought that it could now be used against him, that was the kind of symmetry revenge stories are made of. The DA's office got involved fast. Once Derek delivered the tape, they handled it like a relic, logging every movement, photographing every inch of the cassette, sealing it in plastic bags. When they finally played it in a secure room, the sound that emerged was scratchy but unmistakable. Rudy's voice, thick with bourbon. If Ray ever gets in the way, we pin it on him. His old nobody'll believe he didn't know. By the time it sticks, he'll be too tired to fight it. Linda's softer tone. You're sure he won't figure it out? Rudy again. Laughing. Ray's weak, always has been. He'll take the fall like a good little soldier. The recording clicked off after that, leaving a silence heavier than words. When my lawyer Mike played the tape for me in the visiting room, I didn't breathe for the first 30 seconds. My siblings' voices, my blood planning my ruin like it was a chore on a grocery list. There was no mistaking the sneer in Rudy's tone, or the way Linda tried to sound cautious but complicit. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just sat there feeling the last fibers of family snap clean. Mike leaned forward, his voice low. This is it, Ray. This tape changes everything. It's conspiracy. It's intent. This will shred their credibility in court. But I wasn't thinking about court. I was thinking about that night in Linda's kitchen, the bourbon in Rudy's glass, the envelope with my name forged across its pages. I was thinking about how easy it had been for them to look me in the eye and decide I was expendable. Revenge stopped being about clearing my name in that moment. Revenge became about making them feel the humiliation, the helplessness, the crawling dread that had lived with every day since they set me up. The DA's office moved like wolves finally scenting blood. They filed additional charges: conspiracy, obstruction, falsification of records. The local news plastered Rudy and Linda's faces on the 6 o'clock broadcast, the anchor's voices dripping with the kind of moral outrage that sells ads. Rudy tried to spin it. He called a press conference outside his shuttered deli, insisting the tape was doctored a trick by the DA to smear an honest small business owner. But when reporters pressed him, "Why would your own sister implicate you?" he snapped, cursing into microphones, his face red and slick with sweat. The clip went viral. Linda, meanwhile, went quiet. She stopped showing up to hearings, citing health issues. Her lawyer begged the court for leniency, painting her as a fragile woman, manipulated by her brother. But the tape didn't lie. The town turned. Old friends stopped returning their calls. Customers who once filled Rudy's deli crossed the street when they saw him. Even their children, my nieces and nephews, were whispered about in school hallways, stained by the sins of their parents. And me. For the first time, people started looking at me not as the villain, but as the victim. The trial stretched on, but the momentum had shifted with every playback of that tape in court, every witness who pointed to signatures that weren't mine, every photograph of receipts from the storage unit. My siblings' empire crumbled. The climax came when the tape was played for the jury. The room was silent, every cough and shuffle swallowed by Rudy's arrogant laugh echoing through the speakers. Ray's weak always has been. I sat there, spine-straight eyes fixed on the jurors. Let them see the face of the man they'd nearly condemned to die. Let them hear how my own blood had plotted to erase me. When the jury foreman finally stood days later, his voice was steady. Not guilty. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just exhaled a breath I'd been holding for nearly 2 years. Rudy and Linda weren't so lucky. Rudy was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. Linda struck a deal, but even with her cooperation, she served time, her legacy forever marked by betrayal. Their reputations were ash, their finances stripped, their freedom stolen. And me, I walked out of that courthouse a free man, but not the same man who'd walked in. At 65 now, I carried the weight of betrayal heavier than any sentence a judge could impose. When reporters asked me what I planned to do next, I gave them the only answer that felt true. Live and let their names rot. The chilling part. Some nights when the world is quiet and the cicadas hum like they did that summer afternoon, I still hear Rudy's laugh on that tape, and I know deep down that my family didn't just betray me for money. They betrayed me because they thought I was weak. And maybe that's the sweetest revenge of all. Proving them wrong. The end.